Sometimes, we search for a place to call home, a place where we can start fresh, leave behind the weight of the past, and build new memories. But sometimes, the house we think will heal us only pulls us deeper into a darkness we never saw coming. That's what happened to Sarah and her family when they found their dream home. It was supposed to be perfect, a beautiful old house tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by trees and quiet streets. For Sarah, it was more than just a house. It was a chance to escape the pain of losing her mother, to find peace in the place where her memories wouldn't haunt her. It was a new beginning, or so she thought. Sarah stood in front of the house, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. The house was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt different. Something that pulled at her, something hidden beneath the layers of time. It wasn't just the old ivy-covered walls or the creaking shutters. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting. "Are you okay?" Mark, her husband, asked, noticing the way Sarah was staring at the house. "Yeah," she replied, shaking off the feeling. "It's just bigger than I imagined." Mark smiled, as if to reassure her. "It's perfect. Just wait until you see the inside." But as Sarah stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air felt heavier than she expected, colder. The house smelled of dust and something else, something faint, like old wood and forgotten memories. The children, Lily and James, ran excitedly through the house, their laughter echoing off the walls. They didn't feel it. They didn't sense the quiet whispers of the past. For Sarah, though, something about this house didn't sit right. It wasn't just the creaks of the floorboards or the dust in the corners. It was deeper than that. Something about it felt wrong. Like a secret that had been buried too long and was now clawing its way out. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the silence of the house surrounded her. Mark was already asleep beside her, but Sarah couldn't close her eyes. The laughter from the children downstairs echoed in her mind, growing louder with every passing minute. She turned over, trying to ignore it. But then, she heard something else. Something soft, almost like a whisper. "Who's there?" Sarah whispered, sitting up in bed. The sound was coming from down the hall. Quiet at first, but growing louder. The faint sound of children's laughter, soft and playful, drifting through the darkness. Sarah froze. The children were supposed to be asleep. This wasn't them. Her heart raced as she slowly got out of bed, her feet making no sound on the old wooden floors. She walked quietly down the hall, her breath shallow. The laughter was clearer now, echoing through the empty house, as if it were coming from all directions. Sarah's fingers brushed against the wall as she moved, her skin tingling with the cold air that seemed to grow thicker around her. She reached the living room, her eyes scanning the shadows. There in the corner, a doll sat on the floor, staring at her with wide, empty eyes. It wasn't there when they moved in. Sarah's hand trembled as she picked it up, feeling an odd coldness radiate from it. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this doll had been waiting for her, that it had always been here, in this house, just like the laughter, just like the shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Sarah." Mark's voice broke through the silence, his voice distant. "Are you okay?" She jumped, her breath coming in short bursts. Yeah, I'm fine." She put the doll down quickly, glancing back at the living room, as if expecting something to appear from the shadows. But nothing did. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. The days passed. But the house felt more alive with every passing hour. The strange occurrences weren't just whispers in the night anymore. They were becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah could feel the house changing her, changing them all. It was as if something had settled in, something dark and patient, waiting for them to make the wrong move. One afternoon, Sarah stood by the window, gazing out over the old garden. The trees were thick with branches that seemed to curl and twist in unnatural ways, as if the wind had never touched them. The air was heavy with a silence that felt wrong. It was then she saw it. A figure, just for a moment, standing between the trees. A woman, dressed in what seemed to be an old-fashioned gown, her face hidden in shadow. Sarah blinked, and the figure was gone. She pressed her hand against the glass, her heart racing. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe just her imagination. But why did it feel so real? Why did it feel like something, or someone, was watching her? That night, as they gathered around the dinner table, Sarah tried to shake off the image. Mark, as usual, was telling stories to lighten the mood. But Sarah couldn't focus on his words. The children were talking about something else entirely, their voices rising in excitement. "We saw something weird today," James exclaimed, his eyes wide with enthusiasm. "What did you see?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A man," Lily added quickly. "He was in the garden, by the big tree. We thought he was going to talk to us, but then he just disappeared." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What did he look like?" Lily shrugged, her face innocent. "He was wearing old clothes, like the ones in the pictures at Grandma's house." Mark looked up, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about, kids? You must have imagined it." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. She had heard those same footsteps, the ones that echoed through the house, sometimes at night, sometimes in the middle of the day when no one else was awake. She had seen the shadows shifting, moving when no one was around. It wasn't just in the garden. It was inside the house, too. The next day, Sarah ventured into the attic. She had avoided it until now, afraid of what she might find. But there was something about it, something that called to her. She needed to know. As she pushed open the attic door, a thick layer of dust fell over the floor. The air smelled musty, and the light from the small window above did little to cut through the gloom. She stepped in, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, in the far corner, was an old trunk, its surface scratched and worn. It looked ancient, older than anything in the house. Sarah approached it slowly, her fingers brushing over the handle. Something about the trunk felt familiar, like it had been waiting for her. She opened it, the creak of the hinges loud in the silence. Inside, she found a collection of old yellowed papers and journals, piled haphazardly on top of one another. She flipped through them quickly, her eyes scanning the pages. Most were simple letters, notes about the house's construction and life in the town. But there was one that caught her attention. The handwriting was messy, hurried, as if the writer was running out of time. "They are here. They've always been here. Beneath the house, beneath the graveyard. The curse is real." Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't read it all. The words were too jumbled, too frantic. But then she found another page, and this one sent a chill down her spine. "I have seen them, the ones who lived here before us. They never left. They're waiting for something, for someone to set them free." The door slammed behind her. Sarah spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The attic was empty, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something was watching her. And then, a sound, a soft whisper, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. "Sarah." She turned back to the trunk, her hand trembling as she reached for the journal again. She flipped through the pages, frantic now, desperate to understand what was happening. Her fingers froze as they landed on a page that was different from the others. The writing on this page was much clearer, more precise, and the words, her name. Sarah, if you are reading this, know that the curse of this house is bound to you now. The spirits of the children, the ones who died here, will never rest until you free them. But you must beware. To set them free will come at a great cost. They will demand a sacrifice. Her hands went numb, the weight of the words pressing down on her. A cold shiver ran through her body as the whispers grew louder, now surrounding her. The walls of the attic seemed to close in on her, the air thick with something ancient, something angry. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, and that's when she saw it. The doll. The same doll she had found in the living room on the first night. It was sitting on the floor in front of her, its eyes wide open, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. But there was something different about it now. It looked alive. Sarah. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if the house itself were speaking to her. The floor beneath her feet creaked, and the attic door slammed shut. The laughter started again, distant but growing closer, echoing through the walls. Sarah was trapped, and there was no way out. If you're still with me, make sure to subscribe. The house hasn't let go of Sarah yet, and neither should you. The truth is darker than you can imagine. The air grew thick, pressing in from all sides as Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the attic, staring at the doll. It was just a doll, just some old forgotten toy, left behind by someone who had long since vanished from this house. But the way its eyes stared at her, cold and lifeless, sent a shiver up her spine. It wasn't supposed to be here. She never put it there. And yet, there it was, staring at her as if it knew everything. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices raising from the walls, from the very floor beneath her feet. Sarah. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable, coming from all directions. The room seemed to close in around her. The cold was unbearable, wrapping around her like a vice. The doll. It was moving. Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard a low creak. She spun around, her pulse racing. In the corner of the attic, just beyond the shadows, she saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It was hard to make out the details, but there was something wrong about it. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was cloaked in shadows, but Sarah could see its face now, its hollow eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. The mouth twisted into a smile, an unnerving, unnatural smile. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. A soft, high-pitched laugh echoed through the room, sending a wave of terror through her. The doll in front of her twitched, its head slowly turning toward the figure in the corner. The movement was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The doll knew that thing in the shadows. Help me. The voice wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from the figure. The same voice that had whispered her name. The same voice that had called to her from the darkness. Sarah backed up, her feet stumbling over the old wooden floorboards. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was run. Her hand gripped the trunk in front of her, her eyes never leaving the shadowed figure. But as she turned to flee, she saw it again. The doll, now standing on its own, moving closer. its eyes fixed on her like it had been waiting for her to make the wrong move. A cold gust of wind slammed against the attic window, rattling the panes. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its feet dragging across the floor with a sound that was almost like a scrape, like bones shifting in the dark. The closer it got, the more Sarah could feel its presence, its coldness, its anger, its hunger. "You can't leave," the voice said, low and guttural. "You can never leave." Her heart was pounding in her chest as she turned and bolted for the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. But as she ran down the attic stairs, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps following her, heavy and slow, each step drawing nearer. She turned, expecting to see Mark, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the shadows growing longer. She stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, her eyes wide with fear. The house was alive now. Every room, every hallway, every corner seemed to pulse with energy, with the weight of something trapped inside, something that had never left. The children's laughter echoed in the distance, but it wasn't playful anymore. It was hollow, distorted, like it came from somewhere deep in the ground. It sent a chill straight to her bones. The house had never been empty. The whispers had always been there, waiting for her to hear them. "Mark!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the thick silence that pressed against her. She ran to the bedroom, but when she opened the door, there was nothing. No Mark, no children, only darkness. Her breath quickened as panic set in. Where were they? What was happening to them? It wasn't until she turned back to the hallway that she saw it. The figure again, standing at the end of the hall, its face hidden in the shadows. Its cold, empty eyes were fixed on her. And as it stepped forward, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Its body wasn't human anymore. It was twisted, the shape of a man, but with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift, morphing between different expressions, each one more terrifying than the last. "Sarah," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You have to choose. There's no escaping now. The children. Or you." The walls around her seemed to close in, the air thick with a presence that made her skin crawl. Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her mind spinning. This house, this place, it was never a home. It had always been a prison, a trap. And now, she was part of it, a part of its curse. "You have to set them free," the voice continued. "But the cost will be your own." As Sarah sat there, trembling, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. The house didn't just want to keep them. It wanted them all. It wanted to consume them, to make them a part of its eternal hunger. The doll, the whispers, the shadows, it had all been leading her here, to this moment. And now, the choice was hers. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. The house isn't finished with Sarah yet, and there's more to this curse than anyone could ever imagine. Stay tuned for the chilling truth, the choice, the curse, the truth. Sarah's mind raced, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by the weight of it all. The figure at the end of the hallway was no longer just a shadow. It had a presence, a pull that seemed to drag her toward it, as though the house itself was feeding off her fear. "Choose Sarah," the voice hissed again, its cold tone cutting through the silence like a knife. "Save them, or save yourself." Her body trembled, her breath shallow and uneven. How could she choose? How could she save anyone when she wasn't sure who was even left? Where was Mark? Where were the kids? The laughter, that horrible, twisted laughter, echoed in her mind, reverberating through her skull like a haunting chant. The walls of the house seemed to be closing in on her. The air felt suffocating, as though the very space around her was alive, pressing in from all sides. Her head spun. She closed her eyes for a moment, desperately trying to block out the chaos. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a living thing, feeding off every fear, every regret, every soul that walked through its doors. The people who had lived here before her, the ones who had disappeared. They weren't gone. They were still here, trapped in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very foundation. Sarah. The figure whispered again, stepping closer, its long, twisted limbs moving in a fluid, unnatural way. You should have left when you had the chance, but now it's too late. A chill crawled up her spine as she looked at the figure, its face still hidden in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. She could feel its hunger, its thirst for her, for them all. The doll, the cursed doll, had been waiting for this moment. The whispers, the laughter, the cold air, everything had led her here. To this point, she had to make a choice. But what choice was there? She could feel her pulse in her throat, her chest tight with the weight of it all. She glanced over her shoulder toward the living room, where she last saw her family. And that's when it hit her. The truth that had been buried beneath the whispers, beneath the doll's twisted smile. This house wasn't just built on a graveyard. It was a graveyard. The bones of the dead, the spirits of those who had lived here before, were buried under the very foundation of the house. And when they had built it, they had disturbed something ancient and vengeful. The laughter was no longer just distant echoes. It was closer, sharper. Her heart raced as the shadows grew longer, as the air grew colder. The figure in the hallway stepped closer, its twisted form almost human, but not quite. Its face was still hidden, but Sarah could feel it, its eyes boring into her. It wanted her to choose. It wanted her to make a decision, to free the souls that were trapped in this house or face her own doom. "Mark!" she cried out, her voice breaking as she stumbled forward, desperation pulling her toward the living room. But when she reached the doorway, there was nothing. The room was empty, the furniture undisturbed, but it felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Her heart raced as she stepped further into the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of life. But there was nothing. That's when the walls spoke. At first it was a whisper, a soft rustling sound. But then it grew louder, like 1,000 voices pressing against her, calling to her, begging her to listen. She turned quickly, but the shadows in the corner of the room moved, slithering toward her like smoke. She was trapped. There was no escape. And then she saw it. The ground beneath her feet began to crack open, as though the house itself were splitting apart. From beneath the floorboards, dark shapes emerged, shadows, writhing and twisting, the faces of the lost souls. They had been buried here long ago, their remains hidden in the walls of the house, and now they were free to torment her. "Help," a voice whispered. But it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, each one desperate, pleading. "Set us free." And then there was a laugh. A deep, hollow laugh that sent a chill through her bones. It was the figure in the hallway, stepping forward once more. Its face was no longer hidden. She saw it now. A face that seemed to shift, melting between different forms, never staying the same for long. It was the face of every person who had ever lived here, and it was smiling at her, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Set us free," it repeated, its voice low and guttural. "The price is your soul. Sarah. One soul to free them all. The house creaked and groaned as the walls seemed to close in around her. The shadows were suffocating now, swirling around her like smoke. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The house wanted her. It wanted them all, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then, she remembered something. The journal she had found in the attic, the part that had spoken of a sacrifice. It was right. She couldn't set them free without paying the price. The house had made that clear. She looked around the room one last time, her heart heavy with grief. Her family was gone. Mark, the children, they were part of the house now, lost to its dark hunger. And now, it wanted her too. But there was one thing she could still do. She turned to the doll that was now sitting on the table in front of her. It was smiling at her, its empty eyes watching her every move. Sarah reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she picked it up. The room fell silent. The shadows paused, watching her. And then, she made her choice. If you're still watching, don't forget to subscribe. The story isn't over yet, but Sarah's journey has come to an end. Or has it? The house, the curse, is still out there, waiting for its next victim. Could you be next?